If I were to ask you right now to picture a Shaolin monk, what pops into your head? For a lot of us, I think, it's an image drawn straight from a movie. You know, those gravity-defying leaps, the clang of steel, and maybe a viral clip of someone shattering a stack of bricks with one well-placed elbow strike. We see all these images of the superhuman warrior, someone capable of seemingly defying the laws of physics.
It's an irresistible image, a really captivating one. But it's an image that, over the centuries, has totally obscured the far more impressive and, frankly, the far more useful reality of what Shaolin truly was.
And that's what we want to do today.
Exactly. Today, we're intentionally setting aside the spectacle, the mysticism, the whole idea of secret scrolls. Our mission in this deep dive is not to marvel at the impossible, but to reframe what you think you know by focusing on the method.
That's it right there. We're not here for the highlight reel. We are here for the blueprint. We've looked at a wide stack of source materials for this, everything from translated monastic records, historical military comparisons, all the way to modern sports science analysis of their training. And the conclusion across all of them is, well, it's pretty unified. The actual story of Shaolin is quieter, it's slower, structurally harder, and ultimately much more demanding than any movie could ever capture.
The enduring power of Shaolin wasn't magic. It wasn't some shortcut promised by an ancient master. It was pure, uncompromising institutional method. And that's what we're diving into. The practical, demanding truth of relentless repetition, psychological endurance, and the decades-long process required to achieve truly earned capability.
Okay, so to understand that demanding method, we have to start at the very beginning, the foundational purpose of the institution itself. Where did Shaolin even begin, and what was its original mission?
We have to rewind a long way back to the Northern Wei dynasty. The Shaolin Temple was founded in the 5th century CE, and this is the fundamental, often forgotten truth. It was first and foremost a Buddhist monastery.
Not a fight school.
Not at all. When it was established, the primary overriding mandate was meditation, scripture study, and a commitment to a really rigorous monastic life. Martial arts they weren't in the original mission statement. If you had looked at the early rules of the temple, the focus was entirely inward. Spiritual cultivation, and textual study.
That separation from the myth is so crucial. People imagine it was, purpose-built to breed these elite fighters, but historically it was a place of contemplation, of refuge. So how did this peaceful, scholarly, contemplative sanctuary become so intrinsically linked with martial arts expertise?
It emerged out of pure, unavoidable necessity. Geographical and political necessity. This is the context that shapes everything that followed. Monks didn't just wake up one morning and decide, hey, we should become elite warriors for glory. They had to deal with the external reality of their environment.
Which was incredibly isolated.
Exactly. They were situated in the remote Songshan Mountains, an area that was constantly plagued by regional conflicts, political instability, and just pervasive banditry.
So their location, the very thing that made it a good place for contemplation, also became a huge vulnerability.
It meant that simply surviving and protecting the sanctity of their monastery and the valuable things they held, like historical texts and spiritual relics, it all required functional preparedness.
So the training was defensive from the start.
Strictly defensive. It was not about seeking combat or expanding territory. It was about creating an armed sanctuary. The martial training was for the survival of the community. This practical defensive origin is the crucial, forgotten piece of the puzzle. They trained not for aggression, but to maintain order and protect what they had built.
And that means their fighting style would have reflected that, right?
It absolutely did. It prioritized stability, endurance, and practical disarmament or incapacitation, not, spectacular offensive moves you see in films.
And this need for defense meant they had to integrate that training into the infrastructure of the monastery, which was already incredibly rigid. It wasn't some casual extracurricular activity.
No, it was a comprehensive institution. It was designed to shape every single aspect of a person's behavior, not over a summer or a single year, but over decades.
And that structure is, well, you could argue it's the true secret of Shaolin.
I think you could. Because it was a monastery first, the environment was fundamentally austere. It imposed this rigid hierarchy and a non-negotiable daily rhythm. It was all designed to optimize sustained output. This structure dictated everything. The daily routine was strict. Meditation, intense manual labor, which is a form of conditioning we have to talk about, scripture study, and then alongside all of that, the dedicated physical and martial practice.
It was a holistic environment. There was no room for deviation or personal slack.
Virtually impossible.
I think we absolutely have to elaborate on that concept of manual labor as training. Most people think of training as, a specific 1-hour slot in a gym, but for the monks, the source material suggests the line between labor and conditioning was deliberately blurred, wasn't it?
The line was non-existent. Think about the daily tasks required to keep a huge monastery operational. Carrying massive amounts of water from the well to the kitchens, often up steep paths, splitting and hauling wood for heating and cooking, gardening, tending fields for food, maintaining the temple complex itself. These are not trivial one-off chores. This is hours of sustained, heavy, repetitive physical work, every single day, year after year, under the direction of a superior.
So if a monk is spending 3 hours a day hauling water uphill, they're inadvertently performing a complex load-bearing exercise. It's building core stability, grip strength, cardiovascular endurance, all the prerequisites for martial effectiveness before they even start practicing a stance.
Exactly. The manual labor served multiple vital functions. It sustained the community, it built humility and obedience, and it served as relentless structural conditioning. This means the time they dedicated to formal martial training was used mainly for technical refinement and mental focus, because the physical base, the endurance and the raw strength, was already being built by the demands of monastic life itself.
That just recontextualizes the whole system. The key insight our sources highlight is that what made Shaolin effective was not one single hidden sophisticated technique. It was the comprehensive, long-term institutional system itself. A system that worked not through complexity, but through structure, time, and absolute adherence. It was a societal machine designed to forge capable individuals.
The system was the weapon. It was actively shaping the student, physically and mentally, until the capacity for high-level skill wasn't just found, it was earned over many years of relentless pressure and discipline. The absence of modern distractions, the rigid schedule, the physical discomfort, the spiritual mandate, it all combined into a singular, powerful engine of development.
Okay, building on that idea of the system, let's dive into the mental architecture that supports it. Because the training was never just physical, it was inherently spiritual. The sources show that martial practice wasn't separate from spiritual discipline. It was viewed as a method of cultivation.
And that is the crucial point of integration. Shaolin monks adhered to Zen Buddhism, which later developed into Zen in Japan. This isn't just, mystical window dressing or some formality. This provided the practical mental operating system for the entire training regimen. If your goal is enlightenment, then how you approach the difficulty of training has to align with those principles.
So how did those principles of Chan Buddhism translate directly into their approach to physical training? What were the practical guidelines?
Well, they provided clear guidelines that ran counter to most human instincts, especially modern ones rooted in comfort and instant gratification. Chan championed direct, present experience over abstract theory. It prioritized discipline and self-control over indulgence, simplicity over excess. And perhaps most fundamentally for the physical practice, it demanded endurance and acceptance of discomfort over the relentless seeking of ease.
That's where the concept of dhyana meditation or concentration comes in, right? If the goal is cultivation, then the physical discomfort isn't a barrier to be avoided. It becomes the perfect tool for active mental training.
Precisely. Dhyana is about intense focus and mental absorption. So when a monk is repeating a single, agonizingly difficult stance for 2 hours, or performing a movement thousands of times, the sheer physical demand forces the mind into a state of intense, singular focus. The physical discomfort becomes a meditation object itself. The monk is training not just the muscles to endure, but the mind to remain present, calm, and focused, despite the body's desperate plea for distraction.
So they were refining the mind through the body, strengthening functional readiness, but always with that larger goal of internal composure. They weren't training to win a trophy or impress an audience. They were training to achieve control over their own internal state under conditions of extreme duress.
And this mindset, it directly undermines the modern narrative of talent. We adore the natural gift, the genius who just picks up a skill instantly. The Shaolin system seems designed to deliberately counter that bias.
It almost seems like they were actively filtering for character traits, for consistency and obedience, rather than just raw initial athletic potential.
Absolutely. Consistency trumps brilliance in this environment. The sources indicate that the majority of monks, when they started, were not exceptional athletes. They weren't exceptionally coordinated. That initial burst of brilliance, that innate talent, It mattered far less than consistency and absolute, decades-long obedience to the demanding routine. Talent might give you a 6-month head start, but the system ran for 20 years.
That is genuinely powerful, and it's encouraging for anyone trying to master a hard skill today. It's saying that dedication and endurance will outpace initial ability every single time, provided the system is sound. Progress wasn't accidental. It came from relentless, systematic endurance, adaptation, and adherence.
It is the ultimate long game. It proves that effort is the compounding interest of human development. And to safeguard that system and ensure the principles remained pure, they had to actively suppress the ego of the individual. This is a point that often confuses modern practitioners.
Explain that, because modern training so often encourages find your own style really early on.
Shaolin demanded the exact opposite: conformity and obedience. Students did not get to invent techniques or personalize their style during those critical formative years. They would spend years learning standardized forms dictated by their sifu, their master. Any deviation or personalization was actively discouraged, sometimes through physical correction, until the student's body had fully mapped the principle behind the movement.
So the first 10 years were just about becoming a perfect mirror of the foundational system. No artistic flourishes, no experimentation.
None. Individual expression was intentionally delayed until after deep mastery of the system had been achieved, meaning often after 10 or 15 years. You had to internalize the foundational structure so completely that when expression or creativity eventually came, it was built on a foundation of granite, not sand. The conformity ensured that the foundational principles distance, timing, stability were non-negotiable and perfectly understood before ego or personal preference could introduce instability. This suppression of ego is a huge, often overlooked factor in why the system produced reliable, resilient practitioners, not just momentary stars.
Okay, let's unpack this and get technical. If the mental framework is discipline and the goal is functional readiness through structure, we need to dive into the nuts and bolts of the mechanical workload. This is where the popular image completely breaks down and we encounter the hard, physical reality.
Absolutely. The training was structured hierarchically, and the very first step was foundational conditioning, preparing the structural integrity of the body before any advanced, complex techniques were even considered. The sources emphasize this again and again. You can't build a strong, flexible defense system without a rock-solid foundation. This meant relentless focus on endurance, joint stability, dynamic balance, and critically deep, immovable leg strength.
Give us the defining example of what that preparation looked like in practice.
Yeah.
The one exercise that really epitomizes the Shaolin approach.
That would have to be stance training, specifically the mabu, or the horse stance. This is perhaps the most famous and most torturous element. It involved holding low, static positions, often with the thighs parallel to the ground, like you're sitting on a horse for incredibly long, extended periods of time. We're not talking about 3 minutes or 5 minutes.
So what kind of duration are we really talking about?
The sources, which are supported by anecdotal evidence from modern masters, suggest a student might be required to remain in a single static stance for 30 minutes, an hour, maybe even longer, consistently every single day. And what's more, a student might dedicate entire chunks of their training life, 2, 3, 4 months, to just perfecting the horse stance before being allowed to progress to learning even basic linear movements.
Months dedicated to holding one static, deeply uncomfortable position. That requires a huge psychological barrier to be overcome. It's not just physical pain, it's fighting that intense mental demand to just stop.
And that is the intentional discomfort we talked about in the context of Chan Buddhism. The physical goal is structural integrity, building the core and leg muscles to act as immovable pillars, capable of absorbing impact without being destabilized. The psychological goal is training endurance under duress. When you are fighting the muscle burn at the 20-minute mark, your mind is being refined to accept pain as information, not as a command to cease effort.
And the training extended beyond static stances into movement too, didn't it?
Yes, of course. They integrated practices like walking meditation, combined with posture control, which is essentially applying the structural stability of the static stance to flow intentional movement. Plus, there were countless repetitive calisthenics, push-ups, sit-ups, deep squats, and basic body weight strength exercises. The goal was to make the body fundamentally stable, resilient, and enduring before adding the complexity and speed required for combat movements. The priority was always structure over speed.
Okay, so once the body is structurally prepared through those grueling prerequisites, we get to the core method. And this is the true mechanical secret that people are looking for. Repetition. And I mean repetition to a volume that seems excessive, even pathological to the modern mind.
This is where we see the clearest contrast between Shaolin and modern training philosophy. Modern training, which is largely influenced by commercial gym culture, seeks novelty and variety, to prevent boredom and stimulate different muscle groups sequentially. Shaolin sought absolute refinement and neurological internalization through extreme, sustained repetition.
Let's get granular on the volume here. What kind of numbers are we talking about for a single foundational strike or block?
The numbers are staggering. They're essential to understand the depth of their practice. A single foundational movement, a block, a strike, a transition, was practiced hundreds of times per session, thousands of times per week. For years, we are talking about students executing a basic punch 20,000 times over the course of a single year.
20,000 times. That moves the movement far, far out of the realm of conscious choice and effort and into the realm of true autonomous neurological wiring. What sports scientists today call muscle memory.
That is the mechanical purpose.
Yeah.
The repetition was designed to drill the movement so deeply that it became an intrinsic nervous system response. In a high-stress confrontation, you don't have time to think, what technique should I use? The correct response has to be instantaneous, automatic, and perfectly executed under fatigue and pressure. The only way to achieve that speed and reliability is through a volume of repetition that obliterates conscious deliberation.
And crucially, the repetition itself, the extreme boredom and fatigue it induces, that was intentional mental training too.
Oh, absolutely. The repetition was meditative. It was designed to force the mind to concentrate on the physical execution despite the crushing demands of boredom and muscle fatigue. It's a dual mechanism. You refine the movement, and you simultaneously strengthen the mind's ability to remain present and execute precise instructions when the body is screaming for distraction or rest.
So when we see a monk execute a complex form with incredible speed and power, that final, seemingly effortless expression, that only comes much later. It's built entirely upon this decade-long foundation of perfected, repeated, and internalized fundamentals.
Is the difference between memorizing a line of poetry and having that line become an inherent subconscious part of your vocabulary.
Precisely. And we can't discuss the mechanical reality without addressing the role of impact conditioning, because this is where the popular myths often twist the truth into something sensationalized and, frankly, unsafe. Right, the sources stress that this was managed adaptation, not reckless abuse or some glorification of suffering. Can you elaborate on that distinction and give us some detail on what impact conditioning actually entailed?
The training was undeniably uncomfortable, but it was a carefully managed, gradual process of controlled stress exposure. They weren't seeking pain for its own sake. They were accepting it as the inevitable result of gradually pushing biological limits toward increased resilience. Impact conditioning involved practices like repeatedly striking conditioning bags or even hard surfaces, but always starting light and progressively increasing the force, the speed, and hardness over a period of years.
What was the physiological goal of this gradual impact? What were they trying to build?
There were three main goals. First, strengthening bone density and structural integrity. The body, when correctly stressed, adapts by laying down denser bone material. Second, ligament and tendon adaptation, increasing the elasticity and strength of connective tissue, which is crucial for joint stability. And third, nerve desensitization, reducing the local pain response so that an impact that might cripple an untrained individual is merely uncomfortable for a conditioned monk, allowing them to continue functioning under pressure.
That distinction managed adaptation versus reckless abuse is so vital. It reframes the physical hardship not as superhuman suffering, but as a scientifically sound, if brutally demanding, long-term process of human biological optimization.
The logic is simple and brutal. A body that cannot endure physical stress cannot function under combative pressure, and we must always circle back to the structure. This conditioning was done in addition to the long hours of physical labor required for monastic duties. The monks were constantly physically taxed, making the acceptance of effort and the necessity of endurance central to their entire existence.
So, if the training was this rigorous and focused on structure and endurance, what did the actual practical output look like? Because we're so used to seeing these gravity-defying maneuvers and fantastical feats on screen, what did actual historical Shaolin martial skill look like, minus the cinematic fantasy?
It looked effective, which often means it looked simpler and more economical than the legend suggests. Monks did not rely on magical abilities or, secret key blasts in combat. Their effectiveness stemmed from practical core competencies that are essential in any combative environment, regardless of the era. Impeccable timing, flawless distance control, unshakable balance derived from those foundational stances, and superior physical conditioning.
So the foundation of their skill was the same foundation taught in any good, honest martial arts school today, but it was just built on a structure of absolute, relentless depth and volume.
Precisely. The techniques themselves were economical and extremely practical in their application. While Shaolin developed a vast repertoire of complex forms, often named after animals, the tiger, the leopard, the crane, the techniques that were truly effective in a confrontation, particularly in a defensive survival scenario, were usually the direct, efficient movements. They utilized the superior conditioning and stability the monk possessed to neutralize a threat quickly.
That's the useful line, isn't it? The most effective techniques are often the least impressive to watch because they don't leave room for unnecessary flourish or acrobatics that could compromise balance or energy.
We can see this historically. When Shaolin monks were involved in military actions, like their well-documented role in helping Emperor Taizong of Tang unify China in the early 7th century, their effectiveness wasn't attributed to flashy, empty-hand forms. It was attributed to disciplined unit cohesion and critically superior weapons handling.
And this brings up an often misrepresented point, the reliance on weapons. When we think of Shaolin, we picture bare-hand kung fu. But historically, particularly in defense, that is a very incomplete picture.
It's deeply incomplete, especially in a survival context involving banditry or defending against organized threats. Weapons training was not secondary. It was pervasive and paramount. They trained extensively with the staff, the spear, and various blades. Why? Because historically, a weapon is inherently more relevant and practical in self-defense against multiple attackers or armed opponents than empty-hand combat is.
The sources show the staff, in particular, became almost synonymous with Shaolin, right?
It did. The Shaolin staff, or Gin, became legendary. It was an accessible, non-lethal, though certainly capable of lethal force tool that could be used highly effectively for defense, for disabling opponents, and for crowd control. It reflected their original mandate, defense and preservation, not seeking to unnecessarily end life. It was a readily available, practical implement that they mastered through the same rigorous repetition as their empty hand forms.
So, if the reality was hard training, practical movements, and effective weapons use, how did the myth of the flying warrior, invulnerable to pain, grow so large that it completely eclipsed the functional reality?
The stories just grew naturally. They served powerful cultural and narrative purposes. These were stories of local heroes protecting the community. Victories were exaggerated, feats were dramatized, and the oral tradition amplified success stories over centuries. It's what happens with any enduring legend. Later, literature, opera, and especially cinema seize upon this rich, dramatic material, expanding the myth exponentially for the sake of entertainment, moral instruction, and national pride.
And this is where the real danger lies for the modern learner, isn't it? When the search for the legend replaces the historical understanding?
Absolutely. The danger is searching for a Shaolin secret, a hidden movement or a magical pill where none exists. This search for shortcuts inevitably leads to failed attempts at replication because the seeker ignores the true core. People try to find the one key that unlocks power, but the truth is that the power was distributed across time, structure, consistency, and discipline achieved through a decade or two of uncompromising monastic life. You cannot buy the secret. You must earn the capability through time. The legends inspire, but the method instructs.
So we've stripped away the myth and analyzed the demanding, structured reality. Why does this matter to the modern learner today? Why are thoughtful adults, particularly those who have experience in any kind of mastery, increasingly drawn to this honest, grounded explanation?
I think it's a direct reaction to what we might call the hype economy of skills. We live in a world that promises rapid results. Master this in 30 days. Adults and experienced practitioners are often deeply dissatisfied with exaggerated, fantasy-driven content that promises rapid transformation, whether it's coding, physical fitness, or musical ability. They seek realistic expectations, honest training principles, and systems that value longevity and discipline over transient motivation. Shaolin, when understood historically, provides that exact blueprint for longevity and mastery.
And it's a blueprint built on what might be called an uncomfortable truth? The necessity of selectivity.
Yes, we cannot minimize this reality. Shaolin training was a brutal filtration system. You couldn't just casually enroll and expect to last. Monastic life required incredible obedience, exceptionally high physical tolerance, intense emotional restraint, and a specific willingness to endure monotony. The source material is clear. The system's demands ensure that many did not last. The majority of aspirants failed to meet the bar of character and endurance necessary to integrate the training.
It sounds less like a school for martial artists and more like a forge for character, where the intense physical demands just filter out those without the necessary mental commitment.
The demands of the system were the true master and the true filter. Those who remained were fundamentally shaped by that system over years. It wasn't because they were initially exceptional, it was because they possessed the mental and emotional adaptation capabilities, that deep toughness necessary to integrate the system's immense daily demands into their very being. The system created the exceptional individual over time, rather than selecting the exceptional individual at the start.
If the enduring value for us today isn't about trying to replicate that monastic life, which is frankly impossible for most of us, then it has to be about internalizing the core principles, applying them to whatever we seek mastery in. What are the key takeaways for the modern practitioner?
The lesson is principle, not imitation. If you can internalize the Shaolin principles, you gain an enormous advantage in any endeavor requiring a sustained effort. We can link this directly to modern concepts of deliberate practice and mastery.
Let's synthesize these principles clearly, just drawing from everything we've analyzed. What's the first one?
The first principle has to be that progress comes from consistency, not intensity alone. The sheer volume of repetitions ensures neurological internalization. It's the sustained effort, the thousands of practice sessions repeated over a decade, even if some of those sessions are dull or uncomfortable, that drives long-term change. You have to show up every day.
The second principle seems to be that structure creates freedom later. That initial rigidity, the forced conformity, the complete mastery of fundamentals, like the horse stance, allows the advanced capability and true, personalized expression to emerge safely and reliably. You have to build the foundation before you can fly.
The third principle is that repetition builds resilience, both mechanical and mental. It refines the muscle memory, and critically, it strengthens the mental ability to concentrate and execute when fatigue and boredom are trying to shut you down.
And finally, and this is maybe the most universally applicable to any long-term goal, discipline outlasts motivation. Motivation is a fleeting emotion, it's a spark. Discipline is the steel structure that gets you up before sunrise, day after day, for 20 years, long after the initial motivation has faded. The Shaolin system ensured there was no relying on feeling inspired, there was only relying on the required schedule.
It's the commitment to accepting the necessary drudgery, the realization that mastery is the accumulation of thousands of hours of imperfect practice, and just showing up perfectly imperfect every single day.
The myth of Shaolin promises quick mastery and supernatural ability. It's designed to entertain us for 2 hours in a dark theater. And it's a fun fantasy, but the reality, the historical record, offers something far more profound and achievable: earned capability.
Monks became formidable not by defying human limits, but by meticulously studying and respecting the mechanisms of human adaptation, and then working relentlessly within those mechanisms for decades. Understanding the reality of Shaolin doesn't diminish its legacy, it deepens it. It transforms it from a magical story into a masterful instructional text.
The real Shaolin lesson isn't how to fight. It's about recognizing how long-term, slow, structured, and consistent effort fundamentally changes a human being, physically, mentally, and emotionally. They weren't training to avoid discomfort, they trained to accept the inevitable discomfort inherent in any long-term goal.
And if you look at the commitment required, 10 or 20 years of daily, structured repetition, it demands that we ask a difficult but vital question of ourselves. What one thing are you willing to accept that level of difficulty for, starting today? What capacity are you failing to achieve simply because you're seeking a shortcut instead of committing to the disciplined, relentless process?
Something profound to mull over as you build your own foundation, one quiet, perfectly imperfect repetition at a time.